is in Indigenous repatriation, sacred lands protection, human rights, and Indigenous entrepreneurship. And I've worked out at Bears Ears for the past few years on protecting the Bears Ears National Monument with Utah Diné Bikéyah. I currently sit on the NAGPRA Review Committee. And just last year, I had a book come out on Indigenous repatriation called The Rutledge Companion to Indigenous Repatriation. And I currently am a visiting assistant professor at Brown University. So it's good to see everyone. Judith, I think I'm going to get started here on discussing sacred places protection.
Honor, before you get started, just for those who might not know, what does NAGPRA stand for?
Oh, NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And the repatriation law that was passed in 1990 that seeks to repatriate Indigenous ancestors and cultural items from federally funded institutions. And it has a number of provisions that are helpful and have been helpful over the past 30 years, 40 years, 30 years in repatriation. And however, you know, there hasn't really been anything that jumps into repatriation from private or international collections that would allow for Indigenous repatriation. And so I've done quite a bit of that work here in the United States and also internationally with other Indigenous communities.
Thank you. And just one or two sentences about the committee that you sit on.
Sure, I sit on the NAGPRA Review Committee, and that's a federal advisory committee. And it's housed in the National Park Service. And we periodically have review committee meetings to hear disputes that come before us.
Thank you. We just so honored that Honor works with Native Organizers Alliance in this most important work. So let's get this party started.
All right. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
It is not, yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so tonight we're going to have a discussion about sacred places protection. And we're going to first go through this slide for a few minutes and discuss mostly executive orders that have come through since January. And then we'll get into some questions and a question and answer period so that folks can ask questions. Some of the emerging themes in the new administration have come out through these executive orders, and they seem to be focusing on health, the economy, racial justice, and climate change. And for our purposes here, we're talking about sacred lands protection. And within these themes, there are pieces that are very applicable to our tribal communities, you know, surrounding health. Extractive industries have caused a lot of health disparities and health problems in Native communities. There have also been man camps that have been set up oftentimes in extractive industries that are going into areas that are sacred lands and affecting women, and communities. The economy of local communities is affected as well. But in particular, we're looking tonight at racial justice and climate change. And I think those are the areas where it seems like sacred lands protection is being focused on in the Biden administration. On January 20th, an executive order on protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate change was released. And the executive order focused on several key areas that will that the Biden administration hopes to address. And so things like improving public health and protecting our environment, ensuring access to clean air and water, holding polluters accountable, restoring and expanding our national treasures and monuments, and prioritizing both environmental justice and the creation of well-paying union jobs. And what's going to happen is the administration is going to undertake a review of these issues and take action on federal regulations and other actions that have occurred during the last 4 years that conflict with these objectives. And this is going to be done in consultation with tribes. And in particular, there's going to be an immediate review of agency actions taken during the Trump administration. The heads of agencies may issue a rule or may rescind, suspend, and revise some of these actions and regulations. There will be a submission of preliminary actions to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, which should be completed by December 31st, 2021, and updates provided within 90 days and completed actions that are remaining until December 31st, 2025. At the same time, heads of agencies will send a list of actions not subject to the Office of Management and Budget review to the National Climate Advisory Committee. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And there will also be a litigation review. For restoring national monuments such as, Bears Ears, Grand Staircase Escalante, and Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, there will be a review that will be undertaken with the Attorney General, Secretaries of Agriculture and Commerce, and the Chair of the Council on Environmental Policy with tribal governments. And within 60 days, there will be a submission of a report to the Secretary of the Interior. And with regard to any litigation that surrounds these places, these national monuments, there will be a review of current litigation. Arctic National Refuge was also covered under this executive order. It was stated that there was an inadequate NEPA review. That's the National Environmental Policy Act review. The Secretary of the Interior will place a temporary moratorium on all federal activities relating to implementation of coastal plain oil and gas leasing, the oil and gas leasing program. And there will be a new a review and a new analysis of environmental impacts of oil and gas there. This reinstates also President Obama's executive orders and memos. And just like the National Monuments section, there will be a review of current litigation. In addition, this affects the Keystone XL pipeline. So the presidential permit, which was granted March 29th, 2019, to TransCanada Keystone Pipeline is being revoked. And there was a reiteration of this exhaustive review that had occurred in the Obama administration. And there was a statement within this executive order as well that it wasn't consistent with the administration's economic and climate policies. So preliminary observations, and I know this is a lot of text to kind of take in, or it's a start. We have a review going on with the national monuments, and there's hope that, some of the lands may get restored to the original boundary, for instance, at Bears Ears, or that it may be extended out to 1.9 million acres at Bears Ears National Monument, which was what was originally proposed. And we're just going to have to wait and see exactly what happens in these places as these reviews take place. The next memo that I'm going to talk about is the Memorandum on Tribal Consultation and Strengthening Nation-to-Nation Relationships, which was released on January 26, 2021. The administration said, "It is a priority of my administration to make respect for tribal sovereignty and self-governance commitment to fulfilling federal trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations and regular, meaningful, and robust consultation with tribal nations as cornerstones of federal Indian policy." And what's interesting here is the use of robust within the promise that's being made by the administration. We haven't really seen that before, and I'm going to get in here to some of the additional elements of this memorandum. It called really for a restoration of an Executive Order 13175, which was consultation and coordination with Indian tribal governments, as well as the President Obama's presidential memorandum from 2009 on tribal consultation. What we're seeing in this memo preliminarily is that the administration is trying to bring things back into the space in tribal consultation that existed before President Trump's administration. What also has been called for is that in consultation with tribes, there will be detailed plans of actions to implement this Executive Order 13175, which is so important to tribes with regard to the tribal consultation process, which is often required when we're talking about sacred lands protection and federal lands. And so some other things that have been mentioned are that within 270 days and annually thereafter, the head of each agency is required to provide progress reports on tribal consultation implementation action items. And within a year, the director of the Office of Management and Budget will submit to the president a report on the implementation of Executive Order 13175. Because this will happen in consultation with tribes, it's a very important time that tribal nations and indigenous people begin to provide comments within these periods of 90 days, 270 days, and 1 year. As I mentioned, though, this is a start to things, but a lot of tribal nations are pushing now for consent-based management and free, prior, and informed consent, and that this should lay the basis for a number of these policies. So we're hopeful that within this time period, that the implementation of policies surrounding the promise of robust tribal consultations will include language of free, prior, and informed consent. And the last executive order that I'll talk about is the Executive Order on Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. Within this executive order, which talks about climate change, the administration stated that the United States and the world face a profound climate crisis. We have a narrow moment to pursue action at home and abroad in order to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of that crisis and to seize the opportunity to tackle climate change. There have been discussions about implementing the Paris Agreement and a plan for this to be submitted before the Leaders Climate Summit. And the executive order mentioned also that this will be in partnership with states, localities, tribes, and territories, and other stakeholders. There's a finance plan, which is due within 90 days, and there's some discussion about a Senate advice ratification to talk about an amendment going to the Senate. Also stated was the Director of National Intelligence will prepare within 120 days national estimates on security impacts of climate change, and that the Secretary of Homeland Security would consider the implications of climate change in the Arctic along the border and to national critical functions. And these are all areas in which our tribal nations exist and are a part of, and we are hopeful that tribes will participate as well in some of this planning. There will be an appointment, according to this executive order, of a new presidential envoy for climate. Also will be established the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy. There will also be established a National Climate Task Force, and the Secretary of the Interior will be a member of this. And the Secretary of the Interior will be tasked with engaging with tribal governments. And many of us are hopeful that the confirmation hearings go through as well for Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who's a member of the Pueblo of Laguna and has really pushed for sacred lands protection and environmental responsibility over her term and her years that she's been involved with in Congress. There's also some mention of the heads of agencies submitting a draft action plan to the task force with 120 days and a commitment for 40% of the benefits flowing to disadvantaged communities. But as I had mentioned earlier, climate change is really seeming to be, as well as racial justice, the areas where the administration is choosing to engage in sacred places protection. So we'll just have to see what happens. As I said, this is a start, and I think we're looking forward to stronger protections in our sacred places and sacred places protection and laws. I just wanted to end with providing some of my information, and we'll get into a discussion here momentarily. Okay.
So we have been asking people to place questions in the chat, and we have received one or two. And we also, there's also actually been some discussion in the chat about free, prior, informed consent. So the first question that has come up is, how do federally unrecognized tribes negotiate with the federal government?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. You know, what's interesting is there is a nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government that exists through treaties and statutes, but there's also an enormous body of law that also permits and helps with the engagement of Indian people. And so a lot of times, well, there are a couple of different ways that non-federally recognized tribes sometimes engage in things like repatriation and sacred lands protection. While there's a government-to-government consultation process that happens with federally recognized tribes, also there's a public comment period which goes on for the public. And so oftentimes a lot of Indigenous people participate in that public comment process as individuals. Sometimes they're also, for instance, state recognized tribes might get invited into some of the discussions that are going on in consultations. In other instances, for instance, in repatriation and NAGPRA, which I had talked about a little bit earlier, there are provisions for direct descendants to participate in repatriation, lineal descendants. And of course, there's this entire body of law within our statutes that define Indian people in different ways, and it really just depends on what those statutes are and what those definitions might be. Oh, Judith, you're on mute. I can see you talking.
Thank you. There was a question earlier asked by Dina. No, not asked by Dina, asked by Mary, answered by Dina, about free prior informed consent. Could you say a little bit about that and why it is such a critical element of changing the nature to nation status that we legally and morally should have? And secondly, what is it in the executive orders that gives you hope that we might be able to, under this administration, move in that direction of managing the relationships with tribal governments?
Wow, that's a big question. You know, historically, Indigenous peoples had their own traditional laws. They do today as well, but there was sort of a clash of traditional law and Western law that occurred. And as the extension of Western law happened over tribal nations and tribal lands, it took away that free, prior, and informed consent that Indigenous peoples had here in the United States. And there were some very early cases called the Marshall Trilogy, which redefined tribal nations here, or defined tribal nations as domestic dependent nations. They placed also the capacity of Indian people into something like a wardship, diminished capacity and rights of Indigenous peoples. And so that consent was taken away for a very long time. And it really wasn't until 1924, with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, that Native American people in general and broadly, there had been some instances before, were considered naturalized citizens of the United States. And that was after women had received the right to vote, and African Americans. So, and voting rights also were not really permitted by states, some states, up until the 1960s for Indigenous people. So it's been a long struggle of having land taken away and rights taken away, children taken away from our peoples without our consent. And I'm sure we could have an entire seminar about this, but free, prior, and informed consent is really about bringing back that humanity, bringing back consent to the management of our sacred places, including Indigenous peoples in these processes. Unfortunately, in the last administration, in some instances in our sacred lands protection efforts, Native people were completely cut out of processes that should have been protected by the law. And there's a big push now for implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was signed by the United States, but now has reached a point where there needs to be an integration of these policies and approaches to Indigenous people and partnerships to be implemented into our domestic laws and policies. So many tribal nations and Indigenous peoples are pushing for adopting consent-based efforts within the administration. And Judith, you asked what can be done. It seems like we're moving back into a point where, you know, things are kind of moving forward, but moving back at the same time into the Obama administration and approaches there. But those weren't all consent-based. A lot of it was consultative-based. And so we're trying to push, and I'm hopeful that in this review, in these reviews of policies and procedures that are going on, that consent will be a major part of that.
We have also had a question about if there is a, from Christina, if there is a specific doctrine regarding consultation, or if it's simply an erosion of consent.
That's a good question. I think I might answer it looking at the National Historic Preservation Act and National Environmental Policy Act. The problem with what's going on today is meaningful tribal consultations are important, but it's a procedural process oftentimes in the protection of sacred lands. And what I mean by that is that the government can go through the checklist of consultation with tribes, but ultimately decide to destroy a sacred place with proposed development. And what we're seeking are substantive protections within the law. And if we can move toward that, and if we can adopt really robust, substantive protections and sacred lands protections in either new legislation or better legislation, that would be ideal to be able to stop, you know, extractive efforts that really destroy the places that we have been going to since time immemorial to practice our cultural ways of life.
There is a question about whether or not we're hopeful that Deb Haaland will be confirmed as the Secretary of the Interior. We, Native Organizers Alliance, has been working on first to press for Deb's nomination as the Secretary of the Interior. We collected in partnership with Illuminative, a national narrative change Native group, and the Women's March and 350.org, we collected nearly 19,000 signers to a letter to the Transition Committee to urge that they support the nomination of Deb because of the historic significance of a Native person being in charge of the department that has such a big impact on our lives, on our education, on healthcare, and how the land, public and reservation land, is taken care of. And so we have continued to work and are meeting with others who are part of the process of working on the confirmation. Her hearing has been set for February 24th, and she will go before the committee of the Senate. And what we've learned is that it's really important for organizations to send letters in support of Deb. Because there are many people who support fossil fuel industry who don't understand the connection between policies that put the US government on a footing to meet the energy needs of the United States in the 21st century by ending its total dependency on fossil fuels and moving towards sustainable, renewable energy sources. And Deb has been very clear on that, and she will be set up to do such a great job when she is confirmed, because the Biden administration, as Honor has outlined, has created an infrastructure to ensure that climate justice is a part of the ongoing work of all of the departments, including the Department of the Interior. So we believe she has a very good chance of being confirmed. And then we will all of us have to begin to work to be in good relationship, as we say in Indian country, with Deb, and to ensure that the urgent needs that we have in protecting sacred places and Mother Earth are lifted up, and ways for solutions, that we have those ways to solve the dire situation that many of our sacred places are at. And we believe that with Deb as the Secretary of the Interior and the infrastructural framework that has been set by President Biden, that we'll have a good opportunity and possibility of winning some very great victories. We do have a couple of people who've joined the call who I think that all of you might be very interested in hearing a few words from. First, there's Faith Spotted Eagle, who is a founder and leader of the Brave Heart Society, a traditional women's society from the Yankton Reservation, the Hunktawan Reservation or lands. And she has been one of the traditional leaders that has been leading the struggle, a key strategist of the struggle for over a decade to stop the KXL pipeline, which cuts through the sacred Black Hills and the unceded territories of the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota people. So I would like to ask if Faith could share a few words about some of the lessons to be learned, and really how did this amazing victory come about. And because there are 119 people on the call, if you wanted to set your view, if you go up to the right-hand upper corner of your screen, you can set the view to just see the speaker, because otherwise it'll be hard to perhaps find where Faith is. Faith, are you unmuted?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see you.
Okay, so I had a question for Honor, and it'll clarify my comments. So, and Cora, thank you for sharing it. Cora Newman, because I didn't realize I didn't have it on to everyone. But my question, when you're talking about consultation, are you talking about Section 106 of NHPA, or is there another conception of consultation that is floating out there?
Yeah, thank you, Faith. That's a great question. So there are a couple of different avenues for tribal consultation, and Section 106 of the NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, is one statutory way. However, that trust relationship, that government to government relationship that tribes have with the federal government, as well as treaties that tribes have signed with the United States, are another avenue for tribal consultation. So it's not just statutory. There are these long time treaties that have been in place. There's been a long time understanding from the Supreme Court, as well as common law, and how to in tribal consultation. So no, it's not just limited to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act.
Okay, and the reason I asked that I think is really, really important, because in response to Judith's question about how we did this, it was a long, painful learning about consultation, because I think people don't fully realize what you just said. you talked about 3 avenues of consultation, but when you get out on the ground and the feds are in control, the only one avenue that you have is Section 106. And they will use that as leverage, as a hammer. And when you have folks on the ground in the tribal positions or the communities that don't realize how that plays out, because if you look at Section 106, the whole NEPA, NHPA, those are the big ones that are always used, that like at Standing Rock that was used against us. There's a colonial construct that is in place that disallows that from being effective, because the parties that are recognized in tribes to engage or initiate Section 106 are the tribal historic preservation officers. So having said that, the THPOs have no power. And I think the leaders don't even realize that, because the THPOs are funded by the National Park Service. They're funded by the beast that is eating all of the tribal land. So they have granted them the powers of regulatory authority and no more. So even if a THPO wanted to stop Standing Rock, they couldn't. They don't have those powers. And so I think there's a misconception sometime, and there was some blame laid on the Standing Rock THPO of why she didn't stop it. She had no power to stop it. If it goes beyond the regulatory power of Section 106, that's when you go into tribal government to government and treaty. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. It goes into court. So those 2 other spaces that we're talking about are never even fully constructed to allow that space to be utilized, because everybody runs Section 106 into there. I just went through a horrible consultation this week with the Department of Highways, the DOT. It was horrible. I'm on the advisory board for our THPO office, and the Department of Highways is taking down this bridge. And so what we requested is that anything that comes out of the research on the allotments that are being crossed, that we would keep that under a privacy layer, that it wouldn't be given to the State Historical Society, because in the MOA, it says that it's open for public use, like researchers could go in. And we said, no, we don't want that in there. We want it protected, because those allotments have the first and the last ceremonies. When you're born, your placenta is buried there. When you die, your body is placed there. And many of those allotments have those 2 ceremonies and everything in between. So when we brought that up, when I brought up the treaty, the highway guy just lost it. And he said, we are not talking about treaty. This has nothing to do with treaty. And he just completely went off. And so I said, wait a minute, what we're doing, this is about preservation. This is, we're clearly in Section 106 right now. So you really have to understand the lanes that you're in when you're talking about this, because Section 106 was a little tiny space between preservation and development. Obviously, this is development because of a highway. And so it really was horrible. But the THPO and I held our ground. How we've gone through, I managed to hold in my red rage and get through the meeting. And then the next day, the individual called me from the SHPO office, and she was really apologetic to both the THPO and I. And she had said that she went up to her supervisor, and that was a horrible experience, and that she reported it to her supervisor, and it went on up. And so then they're going to debrief with him on Wednesday to tell him how horrific it was and how racist it was. And then the next meeting that we have, they're going to have someone from the Office of Civil Rights to sit in and observe him during the meeting. And they're also going to bring in the tribal liaison from the Department of Highways, the DOT. So we face that all the time, that Honor, that is just like standard. So you get lost in those fights. And then we ended up doing our own emotional labor to explain to everybody else what was going on. So I think when we fine tune all of this, the majority of tribes do not have protocols for consultations in those three spaces. So in the Keystone fight, I realized that having on the ground, I thought, okay, we need our own tribal protocols for Section 106. So we developed our own laws. We called them Wo'ope. And this is what I learned out of the Keystone fight, is that it's not your agenda. It's not going to be located in your office. It's going to be in our tribal casino. It's going to be on our letterhead. It's going to be on our agenda. We're going to construct little things like that that are big things. Because when they control the agenda, all they really want you to do is sign in so they can check the box. And so part of it is controlling the agenda, and that was Section 106. Section 106 could not stop Standing Rock. It went into the courts, and it went into the government to government, the treaty work, but it was so wrought with violent structures, because there is no organizing entity that when you vent your heart to pieces and you get this information out there, they don't have to take it. They don't even have to send it anywhere. Nobody even has to hear about it. And oftentimes they will use a strategy to have public meetings to detract from consultation. They pulled that at Standing Rock. They scheduled a public meeting at the pavilion in Standing Rock. About 100 people from Standing Rock went there, and they poured their heart out, and it replaced consultation. They said we gave them a chance, and we refused to do that. All it does is makes our heart bleed. But it is a strategy that they use against us. And if you're not, it's almost like the art of war. You have to figure out what kind of space is this. And I think that the Section 106 that came out of NEPA and NHPA, those need to be updated, because they are inconsistent from each federal agency to each federal agency. And it's a free-for-all. They have no idea what they're doing. And I saw that Biden's directive was that each of the feds have to come out with a plan on how they're going to improve consultation in the next 90 days as of last Wednesday. So we have to get in there and figure out, how is that process going to go? What are those going to look like? And we do have one document that came out of our fight against KXL. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, came to our tribe and Standing Rock, and I believe maybe the Oglalas, and they have a GAO report on consultation. I don't know if you've seen that, Honor, but they analyzed the total ineffectiveness of consultation. And so it would be good to get a hold of that report, because it was mandated by Obama, and it is a report that is an actual presidential directed report that is sitting somewhere and needs to be looked at. But we all need to, because we poured our hearts into that and saying this thing is broken. It's totally inappropriate. So this thing can get away from you because it floats in the air. And consultation is a dominance word. Consultation means that the decision has already been made. So in our protocols, we called it pre-decisional. Part of our protocols is we're not even going to talk to you about consultation. We have to set a space for pre-decisional meetings before any decisions are made. And it has to be early. Because by the time you get into consultation, it's too late. And that's what I learned, Judith, is that learning that strategy, because the majority of the people, if you don't learn all of those federal laws, you don't know what the Marshall Trilogy is, you don't know your treaty, and there are some treaties that are not good. So it's like a minefield. And so, and then looking at the state laws too. But those are my thoughts. And that was really painful learning. But I'm ninja now in consultations.
And a number of other things as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faith. We are going to have a whole webinar just with Faith so that she can tell the stories of over a decade of legal struggles, testimony, inside, outside strategies, prayer and ceremony, which have led us to this point of being able to say, the pipeline has been stopped. And there now will be continuing struggles to make sure that the stake is finally in that zombie pipeline's hat by ensuring that all of the easements become vacated by court, which is a process of each individual or who signed easements getting them vacated through a legal process, but it's something that needs to be done. But we'll have a whole webinar with Faith, and we can hear some of the beautiful stories and the stories of angst and the heart-wrenching stories as well. We are getting near the end of our time together, but we do have another guest on the call that maybe we could hear a few words from before Honor ties things up. It is one of our relatives from Mexico. And his name is Humberto Fernandez. And he is a part of a group, the director of a Mexican non-governmental organization called Conservación Humana. I have a Boston accent, so you just heard Spanish with a Boston accent.
Okay.
Humberto, thank you so much for joining us.
No, well, thank you very much for letting me, well, briefly knowing you and get to hear all these so interesting words. My interest, well, is, as I mentioned in the chat, I'm a director of Conservación Humana. It's an NGO that we organized 25 years ago, and I've been working specifically and mainly with the Huichol, with the Wixárika people of, they live in Northwest Mexico. Perhaps some of you have heard of them, of the Huichol. There are some Huichols in our group, but mainly we work with their traditional authorities, you know? And it's been, well, the Huichol have like a 600 kilometers corridor that goes from the West Coast, a little bit north of Puerto Vallarta, towards the east, towards Real de Catorce, a place called Wirikuta. It's one of the most famous sacred landscapes. That's where they go to. So anyway, all this is connected by dozens and dozens of natural sacred sites through very ancient routes. And well, the Huichol have their own, well, the homeland, their own territories in the Western Sierra Madre. But outside of that, they have all these sacred landscapes, which are in, you know, all different types of land tenure, no, of people. And well, they've been threatened by, you know, by all kinds of situations. But mainly in the last decade, mainly by open pit mining projects, no, huge mining projects, many of them by Canadian companies, actually. So anyways, we've been able to implement even some kind of ad hoc or specific types of natural protected areas to, you know, to protect these sacred landscapes. We have been able to make well, all these corridors stretch in different states of Mexico. So in some of those states, now we've been able to change the laws. So now they're in which they recognize sacred landscapes of indigenous peoples. You know? So that's, well, some achievements. But anyways, it's been a long road. And currently the Mexican administration, the current Mexican government is really going backwards. I mean, it's really carbonizing the economy. It's you know, really going against all the trends of the world. And also in terms of indigenous people's rights, it's terrible. So I've always been wondering, how could we make some kind of alliances with the with the native peoples of the United States, no? But anyways, it's just you're short of time, so thank you very much. And,
thank you for joining. Let's be in contact. Let's be in contact. I put my my email address in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and we
solidarity.
Take more time.
Honor. I think it would be really great for us to kind of tie things up with just a few thoughts, because I think, as Faith has put into the chat, a really important turning point is happening in the country, a turning point for the movements for environmental justice, for human rights, and against systemic racism. And that is that we have an opportunity to redefine the relationship between public lands and the federal government and tribal nations. Because this is the moment, now more than ever, that traditional practices of conservation and caring for water is needed. It's needed more than ever. And the idea of co-managing and being a part of the process of taking care of the land, this is a moment where people will be open to hearing about what that would mean. I know there is a movement that's developed, and what someone had asked in the chat, by an organization that we collaborate closely with, NDN Collective, and it's a movement around the hashtag land back. And for some people, that sounds very scary, but when you dig into the essence of land back, what is being discussed is, how is it that tribal nations are able to play their rightful and inherent and legal role in co-managing the land, public lands being returned to the management and care of tribes? Or how is it that tribes now can become a part of the decision-making process of taking care of national parks, for example, which many times these national parks took the land from us and then erased our existence. So this is a moment when we can redefine the relationship to public lands. Secondly, I think it's possible now for us, especially with the help of academics and scientists, to begin to reinstitute, and we're seeing this in different spots across Turtle Island, to reinstitute traditional practices of land management. I think most of you probably have read about the ways of limiting the possibilities of forest fires by using traditional burning techniques in California. And lastly, we really must put all on full spectrum campaigning and pressure on the need for free, prior, informed consent as the guiding management way that the federal government relates to tribal nations. It is the only path forward, because consultation is limited. But I find some hope, limited and destructive. It hasn't worked, it's a failure. But I find some hope in the executive order on tribal consultations, because it says that consultations should be conducted on the basis, on the foundation of strengthening sovereignty. That is a huge statement of intent. And so that's when we put the pedal to the metal and we organize in order to make free, prior, informed consent the way that the federal government conducts all its business with tribal governments. Honor?
Thank you, Judith. Everything you said is absolutely on point, you know, for the protection of our sacred places. Our indigenous people, our tribal nations, our traditional societies, ceremonial grounds, a lot of our indigenous peoples, you know, everyone's been here since time immemorial, and we recognize a lot of the changes in the landscape and the climate. There are thousands and thousands of years of how to take care of a place. You know, something we didn't get into that I wanted to mention is we have certain procedures and ways in which we enter into the land, and there are cultural protocols that also need to take place, which I think are part of land management that should be discussed. And, you know, Faith, or Judith and Faith, I really appreciated you talking about the difficulties that we've had over the years and the consultation processes. Unfortunately, the agencies, you know, don't get their folks trained up in all the same way that they need to. We enter into these spaces having to inform them of what the law is. And that's time consuming and emotionally difficult. And it should not be the responsibility of our Indigenous people to do that. So we're hopeful that with this new administration that they really take a hard look at what this tribal consultation has been in the past and implement free, prior, and informed consent across all policies. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to, in the future, substantive protections in sacred lands protection. It's needed. We need it for our ancestors and our ways of life.
Thank you, Honor, so much for the presentation. The PowerPoint and the video of this webinar will be available on our website, www.nativeorganizing.org, and on our Facebook page, Native Organizers Alliance. And we are launching a campaign on protecting sacred sites, and it will be kicked off in May. And please watch for the announcement. We'll email you all so you can be a part of it. It's called the Red Road to DC, a totem journey to DC. We were contacted by traditional Lummi carvers from the Lummi Nation after they read a document on our website. And so we will be, they are carving a totem pole that will be gifted to the Biden administration in order to remind them of their ancestral responsibility to do whatever is necessary to protect sacred places. And we will take that totem pole to gather the prayers to a number of sacred sites, from the Snake River Dam to Bears Ears to Chaco Canyon to the Black Hills and to the Missouri River, and then on into DC, where we will gift it to the Biden administration so that they will do the right thing. And then in each of those areas, we will have ceremonial welcomes, but you'll also be able to view virtual visits to the Arctic, to Mauna Kea in Hawaii, to a number of the sacred places which the totem pole will not be able to travel to. So stay tuned. We will be sending it out on our email, posting it on our Facebook page, and thanks so much for joining this call. So good night from Native Organizers Alliance.
Bordeaux, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Meeting. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
If anyone gets any time, watch Sliver of a Moon. It's amazing. It's put on by the law students, Native American law students at Harvard. It will give you a whole new understanding.
Thank you.
Yes. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Just curious, does somebody know who J.T. Scary is?
I don't. I was just copying that down.
Oh, okay. Did you catch his email? Because I got the J.T. Scary part. Did you get the rest?
UCC in Wisconsin. It's J.T.
Okay.
J.T. Scary, SCARRY.
Okay.
At yahoo.com.
Okay, yahoo.com. And what did
I
you say?
know Joe. I just realized while I was reading his email, I know Joe Scary.
Oh, okay. That's great. Oh, that's funny because I put up, I'm Sue Moore, and I put up the thing that I had that Eco Justice Summit, and we discussed the doctrine of discovery at it. So did he say he was? I just saw UCC scary
in Wisconsin. Are you in Wisconsin?
No, actually, I'm in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire.
Yes, yes, yeah, but yeah, we discussed. Well, actually, a minister in New Hampshire now, the conference minister, was at Standing Rock for 4 years as a minister, UCC minister.
Yes, there were a lot of UCC folks there. So thank you so much for joining, Sue.
Well, thank you so much for doing it. Now, was this recorded by any chance?
It was, and it will be available. The recording will be available on our website along with the PowerPoint.
Oh, wonderful, because I had to miss the first FO, unfortunately, so I felt bad, but I'm glad I at least caught up with the last half so I could get the gist. So could you just explain one thing to me, Judith?
Sure. If I can.
Okay, what is consultation? I came in with that whole
consultation. It describes the procedure that now is the standing procedure of the government, different departments of the government contacting tribal governments by letter or email while they're in the process of making a decision on infrastructure like a pipeline or a road being built. Mm-hmm. And they check off a box once they send a letter or an email. Many times they don't even speak to anybody, but they check it off as well. We did what we did that.
Oh, okay.
And that's why it is a failed policy. So, being able to change the position of tribal governments to be in the position of being a part of the decisions, not being consulted, but actually being at the table, helping to make the decisions.
Right.
Is the shift that we're urging to prior informed consent.
Prior informed consent as opposed, because I came in just at the consent versus consultation, but that doesn't even sound like a consultation, really. Checking a box, like I sent a letter, that's not consulting.
Or an email.
Yeah. But
all right, Sue. Thank you so much. I will see you.
I appreciate that.
The next time.
Yes. Did you said you were going to have something else coming up with the whole, when was that? With
Faith Spotted Eagle about the KXL pipeline and the over decade-long struggle.
Do you have a date for that yet, or are you working on it?
I'm gonna set it.
Okay, cool. I got arrested for that Keystone Pipeline in August 2011. So, yeah.
All right, well, stay warm up there in New Hampshire.
Yeah, will do. Thanks a lot, Judith.
Bye-bye.
Does anybody remember that what film somebody said we should watch? Like Sliver of the Moon?
Sliver of the Moon.
Oh, Sliver of the Moon?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. How do we find that? On YouTube?
I don't know. Ask Grandma Google.
Grandma Google?
Yes.
Oh, Google. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
That's good.